Hey everyone, this is Mike from the Comic Book Trove, back today with another Omnibus review. Today I'm taking a look at the most recent printing here of the Tomb of Dracula Omnibus Volume 1. As Halloween is upon us just about, I felt like this was a pretty appropriate book to take a look at. Now, I have looked at this book before, not this particular printing, but the previous printing of it, which came out back in, I want to say about 2018, and I looked on the channel, looked at it about maybe 3 or 4 years ago now. It's been a while. But that book actually I had since sold it on. Somebody basically made me a very good offer for it and I ended up selling it, but it was one of those books that I sold and regretted, which doesn't happen too often, but with certain books it does, and this was one of them. So I was happy when this got another reprint announcement, and this time around it will be staying in the collection of that, I'm very sure. So I'm going to have a look at it again, just kind of go through this once more. It's one of those series that I'm always happy to take a look at, so it's a good excuse to look through this book again. And with Halloween being just about upon us at the time of recording this, it is certainly, I think, a suitable time of year to take a look at this particular book. So let's have a look through it then. First of all, the cover here, really like this. Last time around I had the other cover variant, which is that classic issue cover to issue 1 by Neil Adams. This being artwork by Colan, who is of course the series artist on the entirety of the Tomb of Dracula series, and is, no pun intended, one of the, if not the biggest draw of the series, in my opinion. I think that Colan's artwork is just absolutely fantastic throughout all of this. And this was a real passion project for him. But as we can see here then, for the wraparound of the dust jacket, it is the usual kind of classic design. The spine there is a little bit different from previously. On the previous printings, it was just the all kind of plain white. This time they've gone for a slightly stylized version with the Dracula itself font there. And then we've got the cover gallery, obviously, of everything that's in here. And this is the first 31 issues of the series, as you can see down there, along with a couple of kind of crossovers and specials. Volume 2, I'm sure I said this last time I looked at this book. I really hope that Volume 2 is going to get a reprint, because unlike this one, which has had a couple of reprints now over the years, I think this is its third printing, which is really not that many, considering that the original printing of this probably came out over 15 years ago now, something like that. But Volume 2 has never had a reprint to this day, and that's kind of incredible to say, but surely you have to think at some point, when they clearly are giving this book, occasionally at least, a little bit of love and reprinting it, you've got to give us that Volume 2 and let us have the remainder of this main series collected. There's also a Volume 3, which also has not been reprinted, but let's just try and worry about Volume 2 before we get to that one, especially since Volume 2 to me is the big one, because this is the first, almost the first half of the Tomb of Dracula series. It's a 70-issue run. Volume 2 completes it, and so even if Volume 3 doesn't come along, which would be a shame, but at the very least it would be great to get Volume 2. So yeah, here's hoping, continuing to hope. Right then, so let's have a look at this here and now though. So Volume 1, we have got primarily then the creative team being Marv Wolfman as the writer, and as I mentioned, Colan already, he is the primary artist on this book. The start of this book does see some different writers actually. You go through 3 different writers in the first 6 issues, with Jerry Conway, Archie Goodwin and Gardner Fox, each doing 2 issues each, before Marv Wolfman came on with issue 7 and did the remainder of the series from that point on. So it's a bit of a rough start for this series, which, we'll talk about a little bit as we start to flick through it. But as we see here, you get your contents page, an introduction, and then obviously we jump in with issue 1, and that is just a classic cover. That is really cool. Neil Adams artwork there, and just a good image. And not the first, by a long shot, not the first time we're going to see a cover of this series with Dracula holding a helpless woman, or preying upon a female victim in some way. That's very much a recurring theme of this particular series. It's that kind of classic 70s Hammer horror style almost, in a way, a lot of this stuff. But from the very beginning, even if the story gets off to a bit of an odd, almost sort of episodic start, I think, from what I remember. It has been a little while since I've read this, but I just picked this reprint up, so it'll be a good time to dive back in, but I've read it all before. But from how I remember it, the first 6 issues are quite inconsistent, which is probably to be expected when you've got 3 different writers changing, just after a couple of issues each. But what I did, what I was and am immediately struck by anytime I take a look through this stuff, it's the quality of Colan's work as the artist. And I think that is right on show from the very beginning. Gene Colan really, really wanted to draw this series. I think the story goes, he approached Stan Lee and asked for the job. Stan said no to him. Colan did not take no for an answer, kind of went home and on his own accord just decided to draw up a whole bunch of sketches and pin-ups and things of Dracula and ideas he had for how he would draw it. Brought them back to Stan. Stan thought, you know what, actually, yeah, you can have the job, because it was obviously just awesome stuff. And that's the gist of how I think Gene Colan got this, if I'm remembering that story correctly. But yeah, it was kind of a real passion project for him then, I think it's fair to say, and something he very much gave his all, and that is absolutely evident. The artwork is nothing less than exceptional throughout all of this. It's just really great. I don't know how else to praise it. But just again, second issue, second cover, once again, Dracula preying on a helpless female victim. That's going to be seen time and time again. Now, what do we get in here then? So the story is all about, ultimately, this group of vampire hunters. What this series does is it takes a lot of ideas from Bram Stoker's original novel, Dracula, and it kind of plays with the idea that a lot of the characters in here are effectively descendants of the protagonists in that original novel. So characters in the novel like Jonathan Harker all have their descendants kind of appearing in here. Dracula himself is obviously meant to be the same guy, but this is all taking place, way later than the book. So it's interesting. It's sort of working with the ideas originally presented in the novel, but this is not an adaptation of the novel, of that story, and it's not a direct sequel. It's just kind of borrowing elements from that story and reimagining them, I would say. So it becomes more interesting kind of as it goes along. I would say that really, once you get to Marv Wolfman starting to write the book, from that point on, a few issues in, he starts to develop his ideas clearly, and he starts putting his kind of long-term ideas into place. And he's kind of doing, what I think Marv Wolfman is a writer who I compare, and, to me, I think is very similar to Chris Claremont. They were both obviously writing at the same kind of time when their careers started at similar eras. They both wrote similar series in a way, with Claremont on X-Men, and then Wolfman was over at DC doing New Teen Titans. And I think there were similarities in how they both did a lot of long-form storytelling. They would plant the seeds of stories yet to come kind of well in advance. They were both good at dropping kind of hints and little plot threads that would dangle, which would be, seemingly not so important, but would come back into play later. And Wolfman starts doing that as this series goes on and as his run as the writer continues. And that's really where it starts to hit its heights, I think, from a narrative point of view. All the while, of course, it is being excellently supported in the story by the quality of that Gene Colan artwork, which hopefully, as I'm flicking through here, and you're able to see kind of just these page after page, panel after panel of stunning kind of classic Gothic imagery that Colan was so great at bringing out. Stuff like this, with the kind of sort of misty, creepy landscapes even, just very much in that classic Gothic style. Dracula himself, I think, is drawn really well throughout here, and as a character, he's an interesting one, because this is, an instance of a series where it's named after him. Obviously, it's Tomb of Dracula. He is the main character in a way, but he's obviously a villain. He's this monstrous character. So it's interesting as well just to read a series that went on for as long as this did, which is first and foremost following an antagonist story. The villain is the main character here. And as much as we are spending time with those vampire hunters who are out to get him and thwart him and ultimately kill him, the story is really much, you could say, just primarily focused on Dracula. And as a result, what they tended to do occasionally in here, I think, to give him a little bit of sympathetic quality so that it's, at least on some level, possible to empathize with him. They would have these stories dotted through it where, Dracula is, for one reason or another, pitted against some other monstrous character that is shown to be even worse than he is. You know, something that's just indiscriminately killing everything it finds. And Dracula has this sort of, to some extent, like a moral code kind of thing, where there's a certain amount of honor to him. Obviously, it's quite limited at the end of the day. He is still Dracula. But, you know, in showing us that there are worse threats out there than Dracula, it allows you, I think, as the reader to empathise. I think that was the purpose of it. Because if you just had this, if he had no redeeming features whatsoever, it might get difficult to read it, I suppose, was the thinking behind it. Why would you want to continually read about just some horrible guy? So, as much as he is a villain, and he does villainous things, and he's very much, for 95% of the stories in here, completely got his own self-interests and his own motivations, selfish motivations. We do see little glimmers of humanity in Dracula, of his former humanity, perhaps it would be more accurate to say. We do get this issue as well in terms of sort of like standout key issues, issue 10. It's been collected in a couple of different books actually, as well as this one. I know it's in the Marvel Horror Omnibus or the Marvel Horror Lives Again Omnibus, one of those two I think. But the first appearance of Blade in issue 10. A very, very different incarnation of Blade than I think probably the more well-known one these days, the Wesley Snipes kind of version of Blade. In here, he's just kind of a dude with a trench coat full of wooden stakes and bottles of holy water. But, you know, still a classic character. Cool to see him kind of showing up, and he's quite interesting. You know, not the most interesting character ever, but I think overall adds to the cast when he does show up. Pretty cool character. But yeah, so it just kind of is following this journey, and you kind of just, it kind of goes back and forth with sometimes Dracula's getting the upper hand over the group of vampire hunters. Sometimes they kind of beat him, but he always manages to sort of escape at the last minute either way, and you know, live on to prey upon more victims on another day, you know, that kind of thing. But it's a series that, another reason really why I think I'm just really hoping to get volume 2 of this is because it was a series that ultimately did have a conclusion. You know, at the end of this, the very end of the series, I mean, issue 70, you know, it did have a big finale and it actually ended. So it's ultimately a long story. That's kind of how it is, you know, with mentioning again, you know, what Marv Wolfman plotting things so far in advance and ultimately having a complete story that he managed to tell for the most part. I think it did end slightly more abruptly in the very end than he would have liked, but even so, it's a proper conclusion at the end of it. So yeah, but I'm just looking through, just to reiterate this point for the 15th time or so in this video already, I know, but just this artwork, it's just absolutely stunning. I think that certainly out of all sort of Bronze Age era artwork, by which I mean, you know, probably 70s up to maybe mid to late 80s comics, there's not much certainly from those couple of decades that I think is better than this, you know, other than maybe probably John Byrne and Terry Austin's artwork on Uncanny X-Men. But really, yeah, this is like peak, you know, peak artwork from that era. Really just a bit of an unsung talent to an extent, I think, Gene Colan. Not completely, obviously, but even so, I'm not sure he gets quite as much recognition as perhaps he deserved, considering just the talent that he had, you know? Not just in this, although this is obviously very, very high quality stuff, but I think everything Gene Colan ever did, to be honest, was really cool artwork. Overall, it's just a really fun story, and it's a great kind of thing to read, obviously, at this time of the year, when you're getting towards Halloween, if you're looking at some sort of horror-themed comics. And in terms of horror comics in general, just Tomb of Dracula is going to be my ultimate recommendation. During the 70s, Marvel kind of reignited, revived, I should say, not reignited. They were able to revive horror comics kind of in general as the Comics Code loosened some of its censorship rules on supernatural and undead creatures, which they'd previously banned from comic publication. But as the rules started to loosen up a little, they were bringing stuff like this back. So they had Tomb of Dracula, obviously, but also Werewolf by Night. There was a Frankenstein comic, The Living Mummy. and a bunch of other, probably lesser known and less successful stuff. But of all of that, and of all of horror comics that I've ever read, quite honestly, this is just something that stands out. It's my favourite. Very happy to have it back in my collection, ultimately. And it's something that this time around I'll definitely be keeping, and really hoping that that second volume comes along, and maybe one day volume 3 as well, just to have all of the Dracula stuff, the classic Dracula stuff. If anyone has obviously any thoughts of their own on this book, on this series, etc., then feel free to share. Always happy to hear the thoughts of other people. Anything you agree with that I've said, disagree with, anything you'd like to maybe add if I've skipped over anything. Obviously the point was not to cover the entire book and talk of every single plot point. That never is. It's not what I do. But yeah, anything anybody would like to add, I'd be happy to hear it. And yeah, really, I just want to say thanks as always for watching. I hope that this has been of some use if perhaps you were considering picking up this book, or just interested to learn a little bit more about it. Hopefully this has in some way been interesting or useful to you. But thank you as always for watching. Appreciate it as always. I'll be back again soon to discuss something else.